The Russian Federation has captured 3 settlements in the Zaporizhzhia region, reported the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi. According to him, the situation has significantly worsened in the Oleksandrivka and Huliaipole directions, where the enemy, taking advantage of its numerical superiority in manpower and equipment, advanced during fierce fighting and captured 3 settlements. Therefore, our defenders had to withdraw from positions near 5 settlements. In the Huliaipole direction, reported the spokesperson for the Southern Defense Forces, Vladislav Voloshin. Ukrainian troops have completely withdrawn from Uspennivka and Novomykolaivka. Fierce battles are ongoing for Rivnopilia, Yablukove, and several other settlements. The invaders are trying to cut off the logistical route leading from Pokrovsk in the Dnipropetrovsk region. And in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians are already entering the city itself. Currently, according to our sources, there are more than 500 occupiers in Pokrovsk. And just in the past day, the enemy made 72 attempts to storm our military positions there. According to preliminary estimates, our soldiers have eliminated over 100 occupiers in this direction. Fierce fighting is also ongoing in the southern Slobozansky, Kupiansk, Kostiantynivka, Lyman, northern Slobozansky, and Kursk sectors of the front. In total, there were 206 combat engagements over the past day.
The national telethon continues on the 1+1 channel. Yevhen Plinsky, I am Marichka Padok, and this morning we will be working for you. We should already have Dmytro Zhmaylo with us, co-founder and executive director of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation.
Greetings to you, Dmytro.
Good morning, Mr. Yevhen. Good morning, Miss Marichka.
Good morning.
I suggest we start with the hottest area on the front line, although analysis of recent days shows that the number of directions that require attention and some kind of response or action is constantly increasing. Pokrovsk, let's start with it, the Pokrovsk-Mirnorad agglomeration. What is happening there as of this morning? Are we managing to hold our positions? We were all struck by that video that went viral on social media yesterday showing Russians entering Pokrovsk on motorcycles. It turned out that the video is a few days old, but such footage always leaves a strong impression on us. What is happening in that direction?
In that direction, the situation remains, as usual, very, very difficult. So far, it has been confirmed that there are about 300 Russian infantry in Pokrovsk itself who are constantly looking for gaps to fortify themselves. But along with that infamous video you mentioned, there are now also clips circulating online showing their effective destruction. All these units that entered especially are being targeted by the 7th Air Assault Corps. And later, unfortunately, there was yet another video which again showed Russian infiltration into Pokrovsk, but this time without the cover of fog. This may indicate that the Ukrainian units, which had held one of the roads leading into the city between Lysychakivka and Novopavlivka for quite some time, were forced to withdraw. This is precisely in the context of what Ukrainian society demands, that the battles for Pokrovsk must not lead to a large encirclement or the encirclement of Ukrainian troops, and that the main priority should always be the lives and health of servicemen, not the defense of ruins. That is why the situation right now is extremely, extremely difficult. The main objective of the Russians right now is to encircle all the outskirts, that is to take control of the northern and eastern parts of the city, but to say that they are succeeding at this point would not be true. On the contrary, they are getting bogged down in the fighting in some areas and are therefore forced to bring in more and more infantry units.
Mr. Dmytro, let's move on to the Zaporizhzhia direction then. Officially, we are calling this a withdrawal due to the difficult situation. The Russians are openly talking about a breakthrough on the Zaporizhzhia front. How should we interpret what is happening in the south right now? In the
south, well, first of all, we shouldn't be spreading messages that have already been widely circulated online, such as the collapse of the Zaporizhzhia front. A collapse of the front is when the Russians can simply penetrate deep into the territory by 20, 30, 50, or even 70 kilometers. That is what a collapse of the front means. Roughly what we saw in the first days of the full-scale invasion. Now we can say that the pressure that was being exerted in this direction was indeed quite prolonged. And because the Russians focused their main attention on the Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka directions, it's clear that we were limited in our reserves. Yes, there was a certain pushing through of our positions. This, of course, poses a very serious threat in the future, specifically to Huliaipole, which is quite a strong fortified area, and the Russians are sticking to their old tactics. They are trying not to storm fortified areas head-on, but instead are now probing for gaps through smaller villages, in order to bypass large and important defense strongholds. That is why the issue of further construction of fortifications, as well as the implementation of operational measures by Ukraine's security and defense forces, should clarify the situation in the coming days. Indeed, 6 settlements have currently come under enemy control, but I know for sure, because my friends are fighting there, that reinforcements are now arriving to stabilize the line of contact.
Mr. Dmytro, and to wrap up the topic of the Zaporizhzhia direction, do you think the city of Zaporizhzhia, the children and women there, should be thinking about evacuation?
Evacuation from the city of Zaporizhzhia has in fact been ongoing for quite some time, and it needs to be done regardless of the current situation directly on the line of contact, because guided aerial bombs are reaching the city. But to say that the regional center itself is currently under any threat, fortunately, no. Because it's not even Ukrainian OSINT analysts, but Western OSINT analysts who have indeed documented powerful fortifications around the regional center. At least 3 defensive lines. I have also spoken with military correspondents who confirm this information. And that's why, even if the Russians achieve some operational tactical successes in the area of those settlements we just mentioned, they definitely won't have enough strength to break through to the regional center, because they simply don't have enough manpower to overcome these fortifications or to execute a large maneuver. And as for the situation in Huliaipole, trying to bypass an important defensive stronghold, well, that's simply a massive operation, where the entire line of contact would have to freeze, and the Russians would have to focus exclusively on storming the regional center itself. So no, fortunately, there is currently no such threat.
Well, that's exactly what we've been hearing a lot about, that the Russians are transferring all their forces and reserves to Pokrovsk, to the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. They're redeploying from both the south and the north, and then suddenly it turns out that they also have significant forces in the Zaporizhzhia direction. And Vovchansk is also becoming increasingly prominent in the media as a place where the Russians are intensifying their pressure. Why is this happening? Why is it that, despite the fact that our main forces were focused on Pokrovsk, it turns out that they have significant forces both there and elsewhere? They managed to amass a large number of their units.
So, look, these operations that we talked about directly in the Zaporizhzhia direction, for the Russians, it's essentially one group operating there, the same one that's active in the Novopavlivka direction. And we know that this is a very problematic direction, because if we look at the statistics for October, 16% of all enemy attacks occurred in the Novopavlivka direction. But 53% of territorial losses happened there. So the Russians are really using a significant advantage there. And because this is open terrain, unlike in Pokrovsk, they really managed to advance there. The same applies to the Dnipropetrovsk region, because it is currently known that 6 settlements in this region are also under occupation. Vovchansk is also one of these stories, because for now, the situation in Kupiansk has been somewhat stabilized. A lot of credit goes to those units here, and to the drone operators who work around the clock. And that's why the Russians really do have the idea to connect from Vovchansk to Dvorichna, and Dvorichna is directly the main hub where the enemy gathers before storming Kupiansk itself, to create such a continuous gray zone along the border. This is precisely in order to somehow get out of the situation related to Kupiansk, since they fail to achieve a significant advantage. Because the Russians have already rushed to claim that the city is completely occupied, and staged footage is already appearing, produced by the Russian FSB, supposedly recorded on behalf of Ukrainian servicemen. So this is in fact just another attempt to probe our forces further. Why is this happening? It's because we really do have few reserves. We are forced to redeploy them to the hottest spots. Currently, the enemy's advance, and this week alone the number of attacks has increased by another 20%, amounts to roughly 8 to 14 square kilometers per day in different areas. That's an average figure. A year ago, it was about 35 to 45 square kilometers per day. Of course, I'm not saying this is a completely normal situation, but a year ago the Russian offensive was happening along the entire front line, and the Ukrainian army basically had no reserves at all to stop it. Now we have reserves, now we are experiencing very, very difficult setbacks, because no matter what, the enemy has built up its forces. But to say that the situation now is more catastrophic and more difficult than it was a year ago, fortunately, no, you can't say that. Of course, this is achieved at the cost of enormous exhaustion of our soldiers and society, and it's clear that so far we have not managed to grind down the enemy's main manpower.
Mr. Dmytro, and with winter approaching, who will it benefit now in this situation?
The approach of winter will benefit those who will be spending the winter in cities more. For any army, it is best to spend the winter in a city because there is the necessary infrastructure, or at least partially destroyed infrastructure, and there is the possibility to build shelters somewhere to keep warm, because the worst thing that can happen is to spend the night, or rather to winter, out in the open field. This is the main problem. That is why the Ukrainian command is holding on and trying to draw the Russians into urban combat. Because firstly, it allows for better logistics and accommodation of troops on the one hand. And on the other hand, the concentration of a large number of troops in a very limited area of urban development is not like in the fields, where they can simply run past our positions without stopping. That is why this is the main idea behind it. There are prepared positions to the north of Pokrovsk, and Western analysts are also talking about this. But it is critically important that as few Russians as possible reach these prepared positions. This is exactly what the defense forces are working on in this direction right now. Another
topic I'd like to discuss with you is the government's program for mobilization contracts. We see it has been announced that Ukrainians will be able to sign contracts with the armed forces for 1, 2, 3, 5, or even 10 years, with the possibility of getting a deferment for some time after the contracts end. So far, we haven't seen this system implemented yet, but it is being talked about more and more as a tool that could in some way potentially replace the current mobilization format. Do you see this measure as effective if it is implemented?
I think it will be effective because we definitely need to start doing something. We have huge problems with manning levels, and we have huge problems with mobilization. And most importantly, Ukraine as a state basically has no one to learn from or ask for advice, because the world hasn't faced a war like this in a long time. Well, maybe only the US war in Vietnam had a similar character. So this is an issue that has been long overdue. We remember numerous public campaigns about clear terms of service. That is, there is a certain response from the government, plus everyone knows that military personnel who are not on combat positions receive much less financial support, which, given the current crisis and inflation, basically no longer matches the required level. And also, as we discussed earlier, the state is moving in two directions at once. On the one hand, there is mobilization, coercion, and sending people to those units wherever they are told to go. On the other hand, there is the possibility of recruitment, and this continues the story of recruitment where there is better pay, the opportunity to choose a position, and accordingly the chance to choose a brigade as well. Are these contracts fair for active military personnel? No. They are absolutely unfair because people who, since 2022, have come to defend Ukraine out of a sense of duty, many of my friends among them, have certainly earned a break. But unfortunately, the Ukrainian state cannot currently afford this, and it is very unfair, but it is necessary so that the front does not collapse. The current measures are precisely aimed at stabilizing the line of contact and gradually enabling at least some units to have more or less reasonable rotations and leaves. This is the short-term goal that these contracts are intended to achieve. Plus, there was also a corresponding survey of the military, and of course they are not thrilled. Not at all with all the terms of the contract. But the fact that this is the right initiative, and that many people, even my friends who are currently serving, need this sense of an endpoint, a moment when they will definitely be able to finish their service and at least get a break, even just for their morale, is extremely important right now. And not to mention other benefits that can definitely improve service conditions.
Mr. Dmytro, I would also like to ask for your opinion as a co-founder of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation and as a citizen of Ukraine. In your opinion, will this corruption scandal that is currently unfolding in Ukraine affect everything that is happening, including at the front? What should the response be? In particular, how should the military react to this? And how should the country now provide an unbiased response, a response to this? And how should the authorities react so that the country can withstand it?
As a co-founder of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation, we recently conducted a study among the military. And there was one question: how do you feel about young people aged 18 to 22 going abroad? We remember how heated the discussions were in society. I'll put it this way. For most of the military, if I had to sum up the study in one word, they were indifferent regarding the youth, because they see citizens aged 18 to 22 as the generation they are actually fighting for. To put it even more simply, well, they allowed the kids to go abroad, so what? That's if we're being very, very straightforward. Any corruption scandals have a negative impact. There needs to be a clear and healthy message to society here. Society in the rear needs to say that we're doing something wrong, that we're falling short somewhere. When such people, well, let's just call them animals, continue to exist and profit from this war, that's why, of course, this will be very, very demoralizing for the military. But the question is, what are we actually going to do about it? But to say, for example, that some corruption scandal will affect our defense capability, or that there will be some kind of setback somewhere, it will, of course, impact morale. I think we'll definitely see about 10 more people added to the list of those with combat stress disorders. But overall, the military is focused on the war. They are focused on their operational and tactical tasks, on how not to lose ground in this or that sector. So it actually depends on us, those of us in the rear, how this